Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, I'm going to show you 5 cross-hatching mistakes. Some of these I've talked about before in previous videos, and some I've never mentioned, but all of them are simple to fix, which will immediately make your pen and ink drawing better. Let's get started. Mistake number 1 I've already covered in previous videos, so we're going to walk through it quickly, but is making the hatch marks inconsistent in distance. So if I start off with a hatch that looks like this, that's fairly closely spaced, suddenly widening it or narrowing it for no reason. Or if I'm putting down several layers of hatch marks, putting down the first layer with one gauge and then changing the gauge in the next layer. Not only does this make your hatching look messy, it also breaks the illusion of hatching, because the idea is that an artist, by putting down a bunch of very closely spaced lines, tricks the viewer into thinking that those lines are value. So long as the hatching gauge is consistent throughout the drawing, the illusion is maintained. But if you widen the hatch or narrow the hatch suddenly, then it breaks the illusion, and now the viewer, instead of seeing value, is looking at chicken scratches or some kind of texture. Again, I've covered this before, so we're going to race directly into mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is if you have a side-facing plane, so let's say a wall that is receding back in space, like this. Placing horizontal hatching on a side-facing plane, which sabotages the sense of depth. Why? Because horizontal hatching suggests that our form is going side to side, like a front-facing form, as opposed to receding back in space. So if we have a side-facing plane, avoid putting down horizontal hatch marks. The second part of this mistake is if we have a top-facing plane, so some kind of sidewalk that's receding back in space. Placing vertical hatch marks on it will also sabotage the sense of depth. Why? Because vertical hatching suggests that the form is upward facing, that it's going up and down. So, mistake number 2 is placing horizontal hatching on side-facing planes and vertical hatching on top or bottom-facing planes. What to do instead? So if we have a side-facing plane, vertical hatch marks are more appropriate. Why? Because we have our form going up and down. And then if I want to change the angle, I'll keep those angles either 45 degrees or closer to vertical. So if I want to put down another angle, I'm going to keep the angle fairly steep, so that the hatch marks don't sabotage the sense of depth. And on a top-facing plane, instead put down either horizontal hatching or a hatching angle that is close to horizontal, that is relatively flat. So if I want to put down another angle, a flatter angle will be more appropriate. Now let's talk about rule number 3. Rule number 3 is applying hatching angles that are too similar to each other. So if I have a hatching angle that looks like this, if the angle of the next hatching layer is too close, watch what happens. it creates an interference pattern. So where the lines intersect, we have a darker patch right here, right here, right here, right here, right here, right here. Placing angles that are too close to the previous angle creates messy hatch marks that are uneven. So what to do instead? Whenever you change angles, change them by more than, I would say, 20 degrees. So here's one angle, and the next angle I'm going to change by 20 degrees. This creates more even intersections and prevents that messy looking interference pattern in your hatch marks. So every time I change the angle, about 20 degrees or so. This will make your hatching layers more even. Now, there are exceptions. There are certain hatching styles that actually deliberately will set up very similar hatching angles. Why? Because it's a fantastic way of getting density with minimal layers. So if I want to go really dark really quickly, I will deliberately place a hatching angle on top that is very close. Why? Because that allows me to go very dark right away. Sometimes we see this in the etchings of Goya or contemporary hatching styles where cleanliness is not a priority. But rule number 3 is to change your angles every time you put down a new layer by about 20 degrees. That's going to keep your hatching cleaner. Let's talk about rule number 4, which is hatching at right angles. So if I put down one layer, I want to avoid hatching at a perfect right angle. Why? Because right-angled hatchings create little squares which give the impression that whatever you're shading, you're rendering, is front-facing. So unless the object you're drawing is front-facing, so let's say I'm drawing a cube in one-point perspective that's receding back in space, the front face of that cube can be shaded with right-angled hatching. Or let's say you're facing straight into a wall. But if I have anything else that is not front-facing, any other angle, again, a side-facing wall, right-angled hatching will sabotage the sense of depth, again, because of these squares, which create the impression that we're dealing with something that's front-facing. This is particularly bad when you're drawing rounded forms. More on this in a second. But if we're drawing cylinders, spheres, right-angled hatching is going to break whatever sense of depth you're trying to create. Now, this rule only applies if you're hatching in 2 layers. If you're going to leave the hatching layer alone with just 1-2 applications. Because we can break the right angle by applying another layer of hatch. So if I apply a diagonal layer, it breaks those little squares. And the detrimental effects of right-angle hatching aren't so noticeable. Yes, but still, I would still avoid right-angle hatching on things that are receding back in space. Hatch marks that are about 20 degrees different from each other create diamonds, which do a better job giving the impression that we're dealing with receding space. That's rule number 4. And rule number 5 is placing straight hatch marks on rounded objects. So if we have a cylindrical shape, that looks like this. Placing straight hatching across it will sabotage its sense of roundness and make it look like there is a facet cut out of the cylinder. So what to do instead? Anytime you have a rounded object, a cylinder, a sphere, a cone, the human form, it should be hatched with curved strokes. So these are strokes that I call C-strokes or curly strokes. Anytime I put down another angle, those strokes also need to be curved. Now, there are exceptions because there are certain hatching styles which rely on very closely spaced straight lines. An example of this is something called parallel hatching, which was used by such artists as Da Vinci. In those cases, though, the lines are very, very closely spaced together and often overlap in the same direction. These lines are generally not form-following. This is parallel hatching. However, if your hatch marks have any kind of line width to them and you want them to be prominent in your drawing, avoid placing straight hatching on rounded objects. And here is a bonus 6th mistake. Not taking my live Zoom workshop called The Introduction to Crosshatching, the 6 Basic Strokes. In this information-packed class intended for the beginning student, I will give you everything you need to know to get started in this challenging yet rewarding drawing method. I'm going to give you art material recommendations, cover the 6 basic strokes used by the masters, explain 5 simple rules to follow to hatch effectively, and then demonstrate various cross-hatching methods. Then, at the end of the workshop, I'm going to put it all together and demonstrate how to do a drawing of these deceptively simple forms. This workshop should be an excellent launching point for those of you who wish to use cross-hatching for figure drawing, illustration work, landscape, and urban sketching, or just for your doodling activities. For more information and to register, please check out my website, the link to which I'll leave below. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully see you at one of my workshops. Bye for now.